Hello, folks. Okay, this is going to be a follow-on to the blog post. And today I'm going to demonstrate in a kind of a lab environment how to connect an Azure Sphere device to an Azure IoT Edge server and authenticate via the Azure Sphere device certificate. All right, so before we get started, kind of let me give you a framework of where we're at. The device is already claimed to an Azure Sphere tenant. It's in developer mode and it's connected to Wi-Fi, so that's it. There's nothing else done there. And I'll show you guys the tenant and whatnot later. The Azure IoT Edge server is installed. I've installed it on Linux, and it's linked to the hub. And I've deployed the simulated temperature sensor to test it. So let's take a look at that first, just to make sure everything's working there. So you can see here we've got our hub and Steve Edge server here. And we should be able to look at the temperature sensor here and see what's going on. Sure enough, we can see the Edge server sending data out from the simulated temperature sensor. Okay, that's great. All right. Let me give an overview kind of the moving parts here. So we have the Azure Sphere Security Services, or oftentimes called AS3. We have Azure IoT Hub, the Edge server, and the Azure Sphere device down here. And we've got a tenant, we'll call it just a tenant here. And the Azure Sphere device is claimed to this tenant, and it's going to receive over-the-air updates, application updates. It's going to send telemetry to the service. But more relevant to this conversation, it's going to perform what's called DAA, or Device Authentication and Attestation. And a result of DAA is a certificate, a client certificate, that is sent down to the device. This client certificate is good for about a day, about 24 hours. And so we're going to call this the Tenant CA, or the Tenant Certificate Authority up here. Now, the goal is to use that client certificate, connect to the IoT Edge server, send it some telemetry, which will then be sent up to the IoT Hub. Sounds great. Couple of things we're going to look at. First of all, there is a SSL certificate here that the client, when he connects, is going to say, hey, do I trust that SSL certificate? Then the IoT Edge server is going to need to trust the client certificate that is sent during the SSL handshake, and it's issued by the tenant CA that we were talking about right here. So hopefully that makes sense. We need to do a few things to make sure that the client certificate is trusted, and let's look at that right now. All right, let's open PowerShell, not PowerPoint. Another thing is I'm going to try to do this just no cuts, no edits. We're just going to go through. If there's any mistakes made, we'll just have to live with it. All right. So let's do this. First of all, we're going to look at our tenant. In this directory, is basically just the Azure Sphere samples, which we'll look at in a bit. So we're going to look at our tenant for the device first. And the tenant should show up here. Okay, here it is. So our tenant ID is 80CE3, etc., etc. Hopefully you guys can see that. And this is the tenant CA that I mentioned in the previous image. There's a certificate authority that issues certificates for all devices that are claimed to this tenant. And we can see that, and we can download that via the CA certificate command. So let's do that right now. CA certificate download, go to destination, call this the tenant CA. All right, let's look at this tenant CA just really quick. Hopefully that's not too small, but you can see here that it's Microsoft Azure Sphere 80CE3F. Should look familiar. It's the same GUID that we show here. All right, now that we have the tenant CA, what are we going to do with it? We have to, in our IoT hub, we've got to tell it to trust, to use these certificates, the device certificates, to authenticate and to ensure that they're valid. And so we're going to go in here and say add a certificate. We'll call this the tenant CA. I'm going to pick that file that we were just looking at, tenant CA here, and save it. Now devices that connect to IoT Hub and IoT Edge, linked to the hub, will, if they use device certificates that are issued by this CA, they would be authenticated. But we can see here that it's unverified. And so what we need to do is go verify it. And by verification, they're basically saying, hey, can you prove that you have access to this certificate authority? And so what it does is it generates a verification code, and it'll ask you to please generate a sample certificate that has that verification code in it. And that will kind of prove that you have access. And so we're going to do that here. And here, I'll download proof. And destination, we'll call it proof.cer. And the code is that guy. All right, now we're going to go back here, select that proof of possession certificate here, and say verify. Okay, great. It's verified. Now, what else do we need to do? We need to create the Azure Sphere device and link it to the correct IoT Edge server. So let's do that here. We're going to manually do this for this lab. So I've got the device physically attached to my laptop here. And so we can say, oh, not show selected. Show attached. All right, this is our device ID, but the device ID needs to be in lowercase letters. So let's just do a quick transformation here. We'll grab this guy and we'll say new device here, and we're going to make sure it's CA signed. Oh, and let's set a parent device while we're at it. Let's set the Edge server that we created here, Steve's Edge server. So, okay, it's linked. CA signed, great. We're going to say save. Okay. Now, back to our picture. I mentioned that there is this SSL connection that occurs right here when this device connects over here. The server has an SSL cert, and the device needs to basically say, oh, who is that SSL cert trusted? So this Edge server, and let's connect to it right now. This Edge server, you can see here that I have the temperature sensor loaded here. I'm going to just clear this to clean up the screen here, but this is the Edge server, and we can see here in the Edge server configuration, there's a couple of things that I've already done that I want to point out. So we're doing a manual provisioning here, so I've put the connection string for the Edge server in here. And then the only other thing that I've done so far is I've set the host name. Now this host name usually is going to be the fully qualified name of edgeserver.xyz. example.com or something. But in this case, in my lab here, I don't have DNS resolution, so I'm just going to give the IP address. The IP address of this server is 192.168.2.192. And it's important to note that because this name here is going to be the name that's embedded in the SSL search. So whatever you're going to be using in your lab, if you have name resolution, put in the fully qualified name. If not, put in the IP address for your lab here. The reason I point that out is because the next thing I want to do is I'm just going to show you, let's make that a little bit bigger for you guys. I'm going to show you just an easy way from Windows, as long as you have OpenSSL in your path, to look at any endpoint and connect to it and look at the certificates that it says it's using. So in this case, sorry, it's 2.192, port 8883, which is MQTT, and we're going to use show certs. Okay, so I hit enter here, see what happens. Okay, so let's take a look here. We can see here the certificate, the subject is 2.192, which is exactly what we pointed out in the config.yaml. It's issued, means it's issued by IoT Edge D, workload CA, Edge workload CA issued by test edge device CA. And this is what most of your labs are going to look like, or most of your default installs are going to look like if you haven't specified any other certificates. So next step, we want to generate our own certificates for this. And so in order to do that, we're going to use this demo certificate script that the IoT Edge team provides. So let's look at this. Setup scripts, and we've already got OpenSSL installed. So let's do this. We're going to clone the directory here, or clone the repo here, sorry. And I've already done this. I thought I had already created this, but no, okay. So we're going to make a directory for this just so we can, let's call it Edge files. And let's clone that directory in here. And while that's cloning, I want to show you a couple of other things. So we're going to create a new root CA on this side, and he's going to generate a whole slew of things which will end up in the SSL chain here. This Azure Sphere device has to trust this root CA over here. We'll get to that when we get to the Azure Sphere code. But very similarly, the Edge device needs to trust this tenant CA as well. And so we're going to, once we generate all the scripts, we're going to configure the Edge server to trust this tenant CA. All right. The repo is down, so let's look in here. There's a tools directory and then a search directory. And under here, we've got the script certgen.sh. So let's take a look at what they want us to do with this. We're going to create the root CA certificate. And this script here, or this parameter, create root and intermediate. So let's just do that. And that'll take a few minutes to run, or a few seconds to run. What's next? Create IoT Edge device identity certificates. This step we don't need to do because it says here, these device identity certificates are used to provision Edge devices if you choose to use X509 certificate authentication. What that means is certificate authentication for the Edge server itself. We're not doing that. We're using manual provisioning. But we do need to create the edge device CA certificate. And in order to do that, we're going to use this command, create edge device CA certificate. We're going to give it a name here. So let's just use some Scratch here and give it a name. We'll call it Steve device CA. How's that? Steve device CA. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see that. Just gives a little warning here. Don't use these in production. We're not. This is a lab. And we'll paste that in there. Now it's going to generate the device CA. Great. So it generated a few things. Let's take a look at what it did. Actually, let's take a look at what the IoT Edge server needs for configuration first. So in order to do that, in the config.yaml, there's a section here for certificates. Right here. Configure the certificates required to operate the Edge server as a gateway, etc., etc. So a few things it needs. The device CA certificate and its chain, the device private key, device CA private key, and all the trusted CA certificates required for module communication. And this is also where you're going to specify the tenant CA that it needs to trust as well for the client certificates that are being presented to it. So we need the CA certificate and its chain, the private key, and the root, basically. So let's take a look. What we've got here. It generated under certs. You're going to see the new certs that it generated, and you can see here how it generated these Steve device CA ones. We've got the full chain here. We've got the root here. So let's do a few things. Let's do this. Let's copy these into kind of a working directory that we're going to use for the certs. We'll call it Edge certs. Yeah. Okay. Oops. And we're going to copy the root here into Edge certs. And then we're going to copy, let's see, the full chain into Edge certs. And we're just missing the private key. So if you go up a layer and then go look at private, you can see in there is the private key that we need. So it's the intermediate private key, the root CA private key, and our device CA private key, and that's the one that we need to copy. So let's copy that into Edge certs also. Okay, let's go to Edge certs, make sure we have what we need. So we've got the root, we've got the full chain, and the device private key that we saw we needed all three of these in the config.yaml. I'm just going to rename this guy because it just makes more sense to something that makes a little more sense to me. And I'm just going to call it trusted roots.pem. Okay. Now, I'm going to copy this just because I need some Scratch here. Okay. Back to the config.yaml. Let's take a look at that. Okay, certificate settings. So we mentioned we need these three, the chain, the private key, and the trusted roots. So let's just put these in here. How do they want them? They want them in file, full paths, file scheme URI. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to prepend that to these guys so it's easy. Edge certs. Just paste this all in there. Okay, looks right. So let's do the first one, the full chain. And with YAML, you need 2 spaces in front of that one, so we'll do that. Put that in there. Put this guy in here. Should be the private key. And the last one is our trusted roots. Whoops. Okay, so let's double check it here. Edge search, that looks right. This looks right. Okay, all right. Let's save that, yes. Now, one thing I mentioned is in the trusted roots file, I mentioned that this is supposed to be all of the root CAs that the edge server trusts. Let's take a look at what's in there today. Right now, we just have this one. And if we look here, we'll just go to Windows for a second. Let's call this edge trusted root.cer. And paste this in there. Paste this in there. Save that and go back here. We can see here that it's a cert test only. Great. But we need to add something to it, right? We need to add the tenant CA, this green one. We need to add that to the edge server. So the edge server also trusts client certificates that are presented to it that are issued from it. So let's do that. We have the tenant CA. If you recall, we saved that as part of this. We need to change the format it's in. It's currently in a binary format, and so we're going to say copy to file, copy to a base64 format. We'll call this tenant base64. Okay. And then let's open that. This is the tenant CA that we need to add to it. So let's copy that, and then we'll go in here. We're just going to pop it right at the end here. Save that. Okay. So now the edge server trusts certificates that are issued by the tenant CA. Let's do this. I think, one last thing. If you recall from the OpenSSL output, there was already a bunch of data. Oh, I removed it. There was already a bunch of data that was existing. And this is kind of the default state for an edge server. It's going to automatically generate some stuff for you. And we need to just delete that cache. So then when it comes back up, it'll read the config YAML, make sure everything is refreshed. So let's delete those right now. Those are in varlib IoT Edge, HSM. And under here are 2 directories we need to get rid of. cert_keys and certs. And at this point, we should be able to restart IoT Edge. It's going to take a few minutes, but when it comes back up, it should use the new, what do we call it, Steve's device CA. And we can use the OpenSSL command to double check and make sure that it's using the new certificates that we generated. So let's do that. Okay, while that's restarting, what else do we need to do? In the Azure Sphere samples repo, right here, there is an Azure IoT sample. And there's some directions on how to make it work with IoT Edge. So let's take a look at that. There's some prerequisites, configuring it, and we've done all that, setting it up, we've done all that. We need to modify the manifest with a command arg. So let's take a look. We need the host name, IoT Edge, the trusted root CA, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's copy that off and use this, again, some scratch here. What exactly do we need? So we need the host name, which again, we're going to use the IP address here. What was it? 2.192. And the IoT Edge root CA path. And we'll talk about that, but let's fill this in here. Trusted root.pem. Okay, with the two parameters we need there. Let us open. Oh, we already got it open, so let's look in the manifest. And we need to change this to our new command args. And we need to create this file, this trusted_root.pem. Let's do that. And what goes in here? Now remember, in our picture, actually I'm going to clean this up just a little bit, just so we can show this one side. This certificate that needs to go in here is when this connects over here, there's an SSL cert that's issued by a CA. He needs to know how to trust this CA. And the way that it's done is by putting the root CA into the Azure Sphere certificate file that we just created. So let's do that. If you recall, we have the Edge Trusted Root CA, so we're going to open that up. It's right there. I'm going to grab that. We are in our trusted root_pem file. We're just going to paste that in there, hit save. Okay. Let's see if the Edge server is up yet. Takes a little while sometimes. All right, so here's the same command. Basically connects to your Edge server and shows the certificates for the SSL connection that it's trying to do. And this is our 2.192 server. All right. I hit enter, okay. All right, I'm gonna move this over here for now. Just to clean this up just a little bit. Let's see. Did it run? No, it looks like it's still thinking. We don't see the rest of the certs. All right, so we're just gonna leave that alone for a few minutes. We'll come back to the Azure Sphere application. We need the allowed connections, so who can it talk to? We'll fill that in. And we need the device authentication, so this is going to be the tenant CA. You can see the tenant ID. You can see here that's how it's going to be there. And the CMake file, you need to make sure that that's upgraded also, or updated to include the trusted root file we created. So let's do that first. And we're going to put this in here. And what did we call it? Trusted _root.pem. Great. Get rid of that. Okay. And it needed a few other things for the app manifest, if I recall. It needed allowed connections, so you need to be able to talk to this guy here, which is our local IoT Edge server. And then it needed the device authentication tenant ID here. And if you recall, doesn't show it. I think I took it off the screen. Where was it? Tenant show selected. There is this ID right here. This is the tenant ID that we need to put into the application. What that does is it tells the application, says, hey, when you want to use the device cert, which tenant is this device claimed to? So I should look for that and obtain a device certificate from that tenant. And that's this guy here. Okay, so I think we've got our servers here. We've got the trusted root set up. Let's just check on our Edge server again and see how it's doing. Ah, that looks a lot better. Okay, let's take a look. You can see here we've got our 192.168.2.192 workload CA. This can be auto-generated, and it is now parented to the Steve device CA. Perfect. This is exactly what we want to see. And great. Okay. So, is there anything else? We deleted the cache, we restarted it, we set up all of our configuration. I think we're good. So what I'm going to do here, let's see if we can do this all in the same. And, I'm going to open two instances of VS Code. One to monitor the messages and one to show you the Azure Sphere client code. So let's just we're going to go in here and see our messages, just like we did when we first started. Oops. Give this guy a second. You can do it. Great. Okay, so these are the ones for the simulated temperature sensor. You can see a number of different messages coming from there. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to just change it up a little. Since this code also is a temperature, fake temperature, we're going to just change the strings here because it might be a little confusing. So let's just call it Steve's device temp, something like that. And that way it'll be a little bit different. We can see coming through. All right, with that, let's go ahead and try to run this guy. All right, so it's building it. And hopefully in a few seconds, we should see it connect to the Edge server and authenticate. Okay. I guess technically we should have an apostrophe in it. Meanwhile, this guy is offsetting his simulated temperature data. Okay. Okay, client connection, okay, that's good. Steve's device temp, okay, so it's sending some data. Let's go back and look here. We're getting any data yet. Ah, Steve's device temp. Message received from my device, Steve's device temp. Great, and it's kind of interleaved with the simulated temperature sensor, so we can kind of tell what's different there, but we can see it's sending data. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. showed you guys how to set up a basic configuration, how to get an Azure Sphere device to talk to IoT Edge device using the Azure Sphere device certificates. Okay, thank you, and I'll stop recording.